Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. In this episode, we look at the Dentist of Death, Louis Bertrand. Now, he was born in 1840 at Little Stanhope Street in Mayfair, London. His parents, Henry Lipshultz and Marion Mere, were of Jewish background. His father Henry changed his surname to Buckland, but adopted the surname Bertrand. So his family became Bertrands, but he was known as Henry Buckland, which is quite strange. His son was also Henry, took on the name Louis as a middle name, later on using Louis as his first name. Now, Henry Buckland was a dentist, as most families who migrated from Holland and Belgium were, and naturally his son Henry, or Louis we'll call him now, Louis would follow in his father's footsteps. Now, in the 1851 census, only 10 years after Louis was born, his father Henry Buckland passed away at age 31. Marion relocates only the girls to Melbourne, but leaves Louis behind. It could be that she wanted him to complete his schooling in England, following in his father's footsteps as a dentist, which is exactly what Louis did. He became quite a good dentist and worked both sides of the Channel, in London, France and Belgium. He spoke fluent French. It is suspected that Marion took the girls to Melbourne as they'd heard of the gold rush that was occurring at the time, and she thought this was her best chance of marrying off her daughters to wealthy men. This happened quite quickly, and she also was married herself to another dentist. Henry at this point is only 19 years old, but he decides to move to Australia to be with his family. This was in 1860. And although his sisters were married and still living in Melbourne, his mother Marion and her new husband Louis Eskel decided to move to Sydney, and this is where he meets up with them. Louis Eskel, his now stepfather, has a dental business on Hunter Street, but some strange things happen. Louis puts an ad in the paper for his own dentistry. He's only just arrived, but he puts the ad in the paper working out of his stepfather's dental surgery. And not long after this, approximately 18 months, he takes it over. And this Louis Eskel is bankrupt. Seems a bit strange. But as the story goes, Louis, now 20, has his own business which he's taken over from his stepfather and moves it from Hunter Street to Wynyard Square, which is quite a well-known and upmarket area. Shortly after this, he finds a wife, Jane King. They were married in 1863 at the Scots Church. They shortly after have a daughter, Alice Mary, and a son they name Henry Louis Bright. They seem to have the perfect life, but that was all to change. The other couple in this terrible tale are a Henry and Ellen Kinder. Henry Kinder moved from London to New Zealand in 1860. There he met Maria Ellen Wood and married her, but she would be known as Ellen. Kinder was quite a smart and capable banker and had a pretty good reputation. His brother was also the Reverend in Auckland, a John Kinder, the brother also conducting their wedding. They had 2 children together, but it mustn't have brought them much happiness, as we find that Ellen is having an affair with a sheep farmer by the name of Francis Jackson. Henry must find out about this because he takes to becoming an alcoholic. It's not looking good here for this couple, but in 1864 he decides to take his family to Sydney to live permanently and probably to escape this Francis Jackson. And it looks as though his creditors also, as business didn't seem to be doing so well anymore. Maybe he's not focused on it. He's focused on the affair that his wife's having. Either way, they moved to Sydney. But they weren't there long before Ellen finds herself in the dentist's surgery of Louis Bertrand. They become infatuated with each other, disregarding their partners and children. They become quickly involved in an affair. At this point, it's more than what she had with Francis Jackson, who actually comes to Sydney chasing her to see if there's anything that they can rekindle from what they had in Auckland. Ellen is stuck. She not only has a husband, but she's got 2 men she's had affairs with, and they're in Sydney together, and she's put on the spot. They all find out about each other. Oh, except for Henry. But Francis and Louis are both told about each other by Ellen, and Ellen says to Francis that she wants to pursue the relationship with Louis. Francis is heartbroken and he has nowhere to stay. Louis feels bad for him and invites him to stay with his family and Jane, his wife. Very strange. So he stays with Louis, and Ellen and Louis continue their affair. But it gets a bit too much for Louis. He can't stand to be away from Ellen, and he starts lashing out at his wife Jane, for he doesn't love her anymore, and can't stand that he's stuck with Jane and he can't be with Ellen. But he comes up with a plan. Louis decides he is going to murder Henry Kinder. He first hatches a plan to get Henry Kinder into his dentist's surgery, but this could ruin his business. He talks his dental assistant, Alfred, into helping him kill Henry Kinder. Now, Alfred, being an apprentice, probably does everything Louis says, but to kill a man? At first he goes along with it. He got Alfred to row him across the harbour. While Alfred waited with the boat, Louis went into the bushes with a tomahawk, most likely to go to the home of Henry and murder him. He later returned and said that Henry was drunk and his scheme failed. But a week later, at midnight, they tried it again. This time he urged his assistant Alfred to help carry out the dastardly deed. The normally compliant Alfred shook his head this time. Bertrand abandoned his plan after Alfred took off. He turned the boat around and went back. He had to think of something else. It was at this time, roughly, that he told Francis about his plan. He was going to murder Henry and be with Ellen. Frank was very confused. He's going to kill Henry? Now, Louis advised Frank, you better leave. Leave at once. Leave the colony. Go and don't come back. Go back to Auckland. Frank took the money that Louis gave him to leave, but he didn't go back to Auckland. Jackson took the money and went to Maitland, up near Newcastle, 160 kilometres north of Sydney. So Francis is still around. We find at this time also that Louis purchases a pistol. It is rumoured that he actually wore his wife Jane's clothing and went into disguise to buy this pistol. He must have looked a treat, wearing women's clothes and possibly bearded at the time. But he purchased the pistol either way. He had the pistol. He meant business. On Monday, October the 2nd of 1865, Jane and her children, along with a nanny, Sophie, went to visit Ellen Kinder at home. Henry Kinder was home. He'd been in another drunking episode the night before and was nursing a hangover. They all were in good spirits, Henry even romping around with the children on the floor. At 4 o'clock, Sophie was told to return to town. It surprised her, as she had never travelled alone with the baby before. Louis showed up at the Kinders' cottage. Soon after 5, he and Henry strolled over to Din's Hotel at Nelson's Point for an ale. He wanted to get Henry drunk. That evening, the two couples were in the parlour of the Kinders' cottage. The women were arranging flowers by the window, and at the table by the lamp the two men played cards and sipped sherry. Suddenly there was a loud report. The women swung around to see Henry collapse on the floor, bleeding from a head wound. He'd been shot. It had nearly blown his ear clean off. Louis calmly replaced the pipe in Henry's mouth. Ellen fled the room in disgust and terror. Jane, horrified, knelt beside Henry on the floor. The smoking pistol lay on the carpet, and Louis went after Ellen, pulled her back into the room. He pointed at Henry. "Look at him well. I wish you to see him always before you." Was he angry at Ellen that he had to do this? It seemed very odd. Perhaps Louis had asked Ellen in the past to run away with him, and she wouldn't. But either way, Henry was bleeding from a head wound on the floor. But he doesn't die. Jane attends to his wounds and puts gauze on his head. Meanwhile, Louis and Ellen go onto the veranda and passionately kiss as poor Jane is trying to stop Henry's bleeding. The commotion must have been loud enough to raise a doctor, or one of the ladies may have called one, because not that long afterwards, around 11 p.m, Dr. Eckler knocked on the door of the Kinder's cottage. Louis opened the door and announced that Henry had shot himself. He was drunk. He didn't know what he was doing. He never knows what he's doing. He's always drunk. So he shot himself. Jane had actually found the bullet flattened on the floor near to Henry, and she gave it to Louis. Possibly the doctor had known Henry and knew how drunk he always was, and decided that he accepted the situation as it was told to him that Henry had shot himself. Henry was now stretched semi-conscious on a bed. Dr. Eckler gave little hope of him surviving and told Ellen to arrange his affairs, as he shouldn't belong to the next world. Had the doctor had a closer look at the wound, he would have noticed the upward shot, and that a man couldn't shoot himself behind his own head and in an upward motion. It just wouldn't have made sense. But he never looked. This is really strange. Henry refuses to die. Dr. Eckler actually visits again and says he's actually improving. This was not what Louis wanted to hear. He had to quickly come up with some way of knocking Henry out. For good this time. Henry is so coherent the next day, he actually starts telling anyone and everyone who'd listen. "What lies are these people saying about my shooting myself?" he told a policeman. "I did not do it." The constable ignored the remark, possibly because everybody else was saying he did it. And Henry was a drunk. While Henry was improving, Louis ordered Jane to stay with him and care for him, or at least so it looked that way. But he had an ulterior motive. With Jane looking after Henry and Ellen and the nanny looking after the kids, he made Jane poison Henry. She didn't want to do it, but he mixed poison with Kinder's milk and ordered her to do it. Was she terrified of disobeying her husband, or, as was later suggested, had he hypnotised her? The very next day, October 6, 1865, Henry Kinder died. At the inquest, no mention was made of poison. The verdict was simply suicide, while emotionally insane by discharging a pistol loaded with powder. The reference to powder was due to the absence of the bullet, the one Jane had found and given to Louis. News of this had reached Frank in Maitland, and he was going to blackmail Louis. Not only did this pique the attention of Frank, or Francis, up in Maitland, it also stirred one of Louis's sisters from Melbourne, Mrs. Kerr. Now she comes up to Sydney and stays with Louis and Jane while all of this is starting to unfold. You could imagine Louis would want to be with Ellen now, and he is continuously frustrated that he can't be with her. Jane is still standing in his way. While his sister is staying there, she overhears a fight between Louis and Jane, where she is pleading Louis not to kill her and saying, "You promised on your word of honour you would not kill me." Louis' sister gets closer to hear what is actually going on. Louis says to Jane, "I want you to go into the surgery. I want you to write on a piece of paper that you were tired of your life and that you poisoned yourself with your own hand." Jane replies, "No, I shall not write it." Louis replied back, "I will make you." Louis' sister stood trembling, listening in to how her own brother was forcing his wife to commit suicide. Luckily for Jane and for Mrs. Kerr, his sister, it didn't come to that, and Frank sent a threatening letter to Louis about blackmailing him. He wanted £20 and he would leave to go to New Zealand, and swore to him if he didn't pay him, he would contact the police. Now, in a strange turn of events, Louis went to the police and handed them the letter from Frank, advising them that he was trying to blackmail him over false information. Frank was taken into custody, but Frank spoke to a detective, Elliot, and told him the situation, and he seemed to believe him. Probably fearing for her life too, Harriet Kerr, Louis' sister, was sympathising with Louis over his want of Ellen Kinder. Out of nowhere, Louis proclaimed he shot him. Harriet burst into tears. She said to Louis, "What sort of woman was Ellen Kinder to stand by while her lover murdered her husband?" she asked. Louis spread his hands. "I know she is a bad woman. She's the devil's imp. This is precisely why I wish to marry her." Not long after this, all of them were picked up. After Frank telling the detective what had happened, they were soon all hauled in for trial. Ellen Kinder and her children had gone to her parents' home in Bathurst. They'd been writing letters to each other, Ellen and Louis was growing impatient and annoyed with the fact that she wasn't writing sweet things in the letter. She was kind of writing more as a friend, so he called her out on it, and then she started writing back. "My dearest darling love, I have just received your dear, kind and most welcome letter. Oh, darling, if you could only know how my heart was aching for a work of love from you," and several other things a bit smoochy. Now, Ellen must have been a smart woman. She had the foresight to burn all of Louis's letters to her just in case. However, Louis kept all of hers. While they were all brought in for trial, whatever affection Harriet had for her brother diminished. She testified against him with everything she knew. For the trial, Louis's diary and all the letters to Ellen were taken for evidence. During the trial, there was no evidence to prove that Ellen knew her husband was going to be murdered, and so she was let go. But she didn't get off scot-free. On the second day of the trial, a woman from the crowd came up on Ellen and threw something in her face, wounding her. The woman was charged for aggravated assault, but Ellen had a nice shiner. The much-abused Jane Bertrand was also released, amongst a wave of sympathy from the public after it was disclosed that she'd been beaten. Louis stood alone from herein. He stood before the Chief Justice, Sir Alfred Stephen, and during the trial, the judge seemed more concerned about the fact that there was infidelity between these families and a possible menage a trois after it was said that Louis had forced Jane into bed with he and Ellen. So the judge was more concerned about all of this in the bedroom rather than the fact that Mr. Kinder had actually been shot and had Louis done it. With mounting evidence piling up against Louis, the hope now was that he wouldn't be hung, but yet he could be sentenced to life in prison and live out the rest of his days there. After all this about poisoning, the body of Henry was dug up again and checked for poison. The body of Henry was too decomposed to be sure of what poison was used, but they could definitely tell something was amiss. They knew Louis had done something, so as a result, the jury had to reach a verdict. They came back with a verdict for Louis guilty of murder. Louis protested and said he wanted Ellen Kinder to stand for his defence. If I could have poisoned Kinder, why should I have shot him? It proved reasonable doubt, but the jury was still sure that he was behind it. He also said, why should I have told my sister about this when women are not very known for keeping secrets either? He had a fair point, and the judge chewed it all over. In passing sentence, Sir Alfred Stephen told Louis, I have great experience in criminal trials extending over 32 years. I have never known a case clearer than your own. You had every temptation, every motive for destroying Henry Kinder. You were madly in love with his wife and a passion eating into your vitals, and you would have committed any crime to have her as your own. You cannot but be regarded as a fiend. You are not a human being in feeling. I could speak to you with compassion because I don't think you are fully possessed of the mind that God gave to almost all of us. On that account alone, I feel some sympathy for you. The judge then passed the death sentence. It is distressing and sad that a father of any family should die on the scaffold for a crime that makes human nature shudder. But Louis didn't die on the scaffold. Members of the Jewish community, led by Bertrand's wealthy uncle, briefed the brilliant young barrister Julian Solomons, and he requested a new trial to the Supreme Court of New South Wales. This time he was able to get Louis life in jail, which meant he wasn't going to be hung now. Louis confessed to everything, and it was lucky that he had the money to pay for such things. So instead of being hung, Louis was taken to various facilities. He spent some time at Parramatta Lunatic Asylum, but most of his time was spent at Darlinghurst Jail. And while he was there, he was actually quite close to Captain Starlight, which it seems Captain Starlight has a bit of a story of his own. Together they painted some of the jail. It was rumoured that he did the stained glass windows, but it was more likely that he painted above them. Now, after these 28 years had been served, Louis was released from jail. He was now 53 years old. He stayed one night at the Metropole Hotel in Sydney and then was deported back to London. It is understood that after the trial, when Louis was put behind bars, Jane and the kids moved to Auckland, and her descendants still live there. Ellen lost no time in getting married. She married a Humphrey Minchin Carden in 1867, and they also briefly lived in Auckland, just down the road from Reverend John Kinder, Henry's brother. In 1869, Ellen and Humphrey, with their new daughter, and Ellen's family, emigrated to San Francisco. Ellen died there in 1883, aged 40. It is not known what happened to Frank, but it is believed that he probably returned to Auckland as well. Louis outlived everybody. Upon arrival back in London, he settled back in where he'd left off before coming to Australia and continued practicing as a dentist under the name Edward Henry Burton in London. He and his housekeeper, Carolyn Amelia Ladd, moved to Portsmouth in 1902. However, in 1909, she died after complaining that she thought she was being poisoned. An inquest found that she died from natural causes, but it is possible that Louis poisoned her. Louis died on September 11th, 1924, from senility. He was just a fortnight short of his 84th birthday. This case was so bizarre at the time that a waxworks exhibition in Sydney of Madame Sohiers showcased Mr. and Mrs. Kinder as well as Louis Bertrand, their likeness in wax for all to see. A genius corrupted by passion, or a serial killer disguised as a talented man, we will never know which Louis Bertrand truly was. We hope you enjoyed this episode of The Dentist of Death. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting new videos. And a big thank you. We've hit 200 subscribers now, just over. Thank you so much for supporting us so as we can continue to put out these videos.